Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Anthropuzzled podcast. I'm your host, Abby Letzinger, and every 2 weeks we'll explore how anthropologists are forging unique career paths beyond the usual academic sphere. Tune in, get inspired, and start piecing together your own career puzzle within the world of anthropology. On today's episode, we're joined by Jena Barchas-Lichtenstein, who holds a PhD and Master's in Linguistic Anthropology from UCLA, along with a Bachelor's in Linguistics and Anthropology from the University of Chicago. They currently work in audience research as a principal researcher for Phonology. How are you doing today, Jena?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing great. So what exactly is an audience researcher and why are they important?
This is a great question. Audience research often means two different things, which I'll break down in a second. So very broadly, we work for institutions like museums, where it's sometimes called visitor research, or zoos and aquariums, and media, where it is generally audience research. And we try to understand the relationships between an institution's audience and the institution. And the reason that I said that it is two different things is that sometimes audience research is really focused on the business side of things. And so the focus is on metrics and reach and how can we get more people to walk in the door of our institution or pay attention to our content. And sometimes it's more focused on outcomes and impact. And in those cases, we're studying things like, what are people learning from engaging with our institution or our content? What do people need to get the most out of our institution or our content? I tend to do work that's more in the second space than the first, but a lot of roles and a lot of projects bring the two together.
Okay. And so how does your linguistic anthropology degree kind of play a role in audience research?
One big piece of that is methods. So from linguistic anthropology, I have a pretty big methods toolkit. On the one hand, a lot of the work we do is interviews, group interviews, focus groups discussions, survey design, questionnaires. That said, I also do get to use my linguistic anthropology tools surprisingly often. There's a fair amount of thinking about how ideas and information circulates that comes from linguistic anthropology that I use in my research a lot. And sometimes a fair bit of discourse analysis, particularly in thinking about how to communicate better, which is also part of the work I do.
Okay. And I know I clarified kind of what linguistic anthropology was in my original episode, but can you kind of give a description of what linguistic anthropology is?
Oh, yeah. This is my favorite question. Linguistic anthropology has a branding problem. Nobody really knows what we do. But really, basically, it's the study of language and other kinds of symbolic communicative resources. I promise I'll break that down in a second. Language and symbolic communicative resources as social tools. So when you think about linguistics is often studying language as a formal system, whereas linguistic anthropologists are studying what we do with language socially. And my favorite example is greetings, because greetings don't just reflect social reality, they really help create it. So you are meeting someone you don't know super well for coffee. And if you say, hey, dude, and you punch them in the arm, or you say, hi, you look great, you are constructing that interaction as a very different kind of meeting.
Okay. I would not have thought of that way. Because like in my mind, even though I have an idea of what linguistic anthropology is, in my mind, it's like Egyptologists who go and study hieroglyphics and analyze them and break them down and be like, oh, this is what it means in English kind of way.
And I think actually it's much more common. Most of us are working in more ethnographic contexts with folks using language to do day-to-day life.
Yeah. And so how did you get into becoming a linguistic anthropologist? What was your school experience like, volunteer? What just made you say, I want to be an anthropologist?
So I really thought that I wanted to be a linguist. I don't remember exactly how I found linguistics, except that I was in high school and I was obsessed. But I found myself getting frustrated in my linguistics coursework that so much of what we were doing with language had very little to do with people, because to me, what's interesting about language is how we use it.
Mm-hmm.
And someone told me I should take linguistic anthropology courses, and the rest is history. So I did a double major in linguistics and anthropology. In part because I'd already done all the linguistics coursework and was like, well, I might as well do both of these things. And really found them both useful. For me, it's all about how do people communicate. I really strongly believe that communication is always interactive. So it's even in the case of something like broadcast television, which you probably think of as one person communicating and one person listening, it's a lot more social and interactive than that.
And what's the difference between linguistics and linguistics anthropology? Is it just the difference of it has the human element in it?
Oof. This is one of those complicated questions. In the same way that if you ask what's the difference between sociology and anthropology, a lot of the difference is what are you reading? There's a whole historical trajectory of these disciplines, and people often are doing really similar work in both of them. So it's not a clear boundary. There's a lot of fuzz. There's a lot of overlap where we're doing related work. But really broadly, linguistic anthropologists are almost never interested in language without people, and some linguists are interested in language without people, though a lot of linguists are also interested in that overlap of language and people.
Okay. And are there any projects or publications that you're currently working on that you would like to discuss? Kind of give people a better look of what it is you do in your day-to-day life.
Sure. I work on about 12 projects at a time, so there's always a lot of things that I am doing. I will talk about 2, and all of the work I do, as I've sort of implied, is in partnership with museums, filmmakers, news organizations. The 2 examples that I'll give are both with news organizations. They're both with PBS News. So we just finished a 5-year project, which was funded by the National Science Foundation, where we were looking at the use of statistics in the news, and specifically how journalists can write about statistics and visualize statistics in ways that make it a little bit easier for adults who may or may not have any formal background in statistics to understand what the heck is going on. My role was very much leading the research, so collaborating closely with journalists who were trying different stuff with their content, which was really fun, but doing surveys to understand whether there's any relationship between people's news habits and their statistical knowledge, doing focus groups where we sat people down and went, all right, just try to make sense of what you're looking at from this news story. Just work it out together. I'm listening. I might ask some questions. Those were really fun. Sometimes we did experiments where people saw one of 2 versions of the same paragraph or the same figure, and we looked at which one they were better able to interpret. So that's one really big project. And then with some of the same partners, we're doing a project now around climate journalism, and specifically the representation of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous communities and solutions to climate change that are coming out of those communities.
So when you guys are doing these surveys, how do you find people for them? Do you just kind of go on the street and be like, hey, you want to participate, or?
That's a great question. So it obviously looks pretty different for a news organization than a museum, right? Because in a museum, we actually are just stopping people, usually in the museum. Hey, would you be willing to answer a couple of quick questions about your visit today? Hey, would you be willing to answer some quick questions about this exhibit that we're standing in? The sampling is sort of straightforward in that sense. Whereas with media organizations, it's a little bit different. So generally, we're looking for one of 2 groups, and it really depends on the project which one. If we're looking for people who are already in the current audience of the news organization, we're usually doing recruitment in partnership with the news organization. We used to do a lot on social media. In the last few years, that's become very unreliable. We get a lot of bots and a lot of survey farms, which is basically people who are trying to get whatever small incentive that we're proposing and aren't answering honestly. We still have pretty good luck from newsletters, which people really sign up for. They tend to be a little more of an active audience of the news outlet. So that's been successful. Sometimes we work with panel providers where we do a screener and look to see, do you get news from this source, yes or no? So those are typically the ways that we go when we're trying to get people who are already regular audience members of the media organization. Sometimes, though, we're looking for just general adult audience. And so when we do that, we typically work with an online panel provider. There's a bunch of companies that specialize in recruiting, and some of them can get a more or less representative panel of U.S. adults. So you're getting folks who, at least along several demographic factors, look like the broader American public, and then we can generalize a little more. Whereas when we're working with a specific audience, it's a little more of a convenient sample. I don't know how much you want me to just nerd out about research methods.
Yes, no, nerd away, because, there's not a lot of people they've probably heard about like user experience research, not so much like audience research. I don't know if that's like kind of in the same ballpark, but yeah, nerd away. I'd love to hear it.
So fairly different in the sense that I'm not usually helping people develop a technical interface, but more what background knowledge does your audience already have about this topic? What stereotypes does your audience already have about this topic? So either what do they already know or what do they think they know? Sometimes it's, can we see learning? Do we have evidence that something is changing for them?
Okay. And so with these surveys, usually how long do you guys do the surveys for? Is it over an extended period of time, or is it kind of like random, I guess?
It really depends on the project. So the projects I work on range from 3 months to 5 years.
Wow.
And the methods depend on the project. Interviews are probably obviously a lot more time consuming than surveys from our point of view, because the survey, you program it online and then you run it. Interviews, we need personnel for every single interview. We have to transcribe. The analysis is often a lot more complicated. So it's really hard to generalize it. It depends on the goals of the research, what we're trying to learn. Yeah, it's very hard for me to give you a sort of answer that will always be true.
Yeah, no worries. And the data that you guys collect, is it more qualitative than quantitative?
Really depends.
Depends on the project.
Depends on the questions we're asking.
Okay.
I would say in general, I'm a very big believer, and my organization is a very big believer in mixed methods. So combination, and again, really depends on what we're trying to find out.
Gotcha. Okay. With a linguistic anthropology degree, because you said you had gotten like your bachelor's beginning in linguistics and then anthropology, and then when you went to go get your master's and PhD, it was in specifically linguistic anthropology. What was getting into grad school like?
I took 2 years off between undergrad and grad school. I graduated from college almost 20 years ago, so I don't know how relevant my application experience is to people applying to graduate school today. I'm going to be very honest.
Yeah.
And I also don't remember a lot of the details that well at this point. It's been a while.
Oh, that's fine. Do you feel that like waiting 2 years between undergrad and getting your master's, it kind of allowed you to pick a more specific thing to study? Because, going into the workforce and kind of looking and seeing what's out there and being like, oh, I would love to study this, and then making that your topic.
I think I went about it wrong.
Okay.
So if I could go back, I always knew I was going to go to grad school, and I took a year or two off, but I always had the plan of going back. And I think that I wish I had been more open-minded, and I wish I had spent those 2 years really trying to understand what I could do without a graduate degree, and really thought about career paths and did not assume that I was going back to school. Because I think in some ways I learned a lot from the jobs that I had, but I was not necessarily concerned with, is this something I want to do forever? Because I knew I wasn't going to do it forever. And I think being more open to that would have been better. I think I'm much less of a fan of graduate education than I was at the time. And I think there's a lot that people can do without it. And it's really expensive. It's really time consuming. And there's a lot of reasons not to do it. So that's why I say I think I did it wrong, in the sense that I didn't give my jobs that I had then a real chance.
Yeah, and that's what one of my anthropology teachers has told me is, when I was considering going into grad school, she's like, well, do you know what you want to study? And I'm like, not really. Like, just in a ballpark of anthropology. And her advice was, don't go to grad school if you don't know what it is you want to study specifically, and do the research to make sure that the jobs that you are wanting, whether or not they require a master's degree. Because if it doesn't require master's degrees, why get it?
I think that's really good advice. And this is one thing that has changed since I applied to grad school in, 2006. Which is a lot of people, and I absolutely count myself among them. If you apply to grad school straight out of undergrad or even a couple of years out, at that point, all you've done with your life is be in school. And a lot of people feel like I'm really good at school, so I should just do more school because I'm good at this. And again, I say that this was me, so I don't mean it judgmentally, I mean it factually. That was my attitude. And first of all, grad school is very different from undergrad in ways I didn't fully appreciate until I was most of the way done with it. But also, that's a lot of years to be pretty broke. Even if you're in a funded program, you're still earning probably less than an entry-level wage for 6 to 10 years. And that does not set you up well financially for the rest of your life. And I don't think I fully appreciated that until much later.
Yeah, I have a couple of friends who have gotten their master's, or they're currently getting their master's/PhD, and they're like, well, in my contract, even because it's funded by the school, in my contract, I can't get another job, but this one barely pays enough for the bills. So you're kind of in that like limbo of just being poor all the time and hoping that you get a good enough paying job out of college that will pay off your loans if you have them. But usually that's not the case.
Yeah, it's not. I think, and I hope this is changing, but at least at that time when I was making that decision, no one really sat me down and talked to me about the long-term financial implications of not contributing to a retirement fund for all of my 20s.
Yeah, I definitely think that's stuff that should be included in like high school lessons, because when you're in college, you're not really thinking about that. And you don't really, that's when you start filing taxes and you're not with your parents anymore if you were with your parents. And yeah, lots of fun learning experiences. But anyways, so do you feel that being an audience researcher, is there not so much a better degree, but like, are there other degrees out there other than linguistic anthropology that would help get your foot in the door into being an audience researcher?
I think anything where you learn a broad set of research methods sets you up well to do this kind of work. There is a lot of content and academic literature knowledge that I have from the field that I end up using a lot, but the stuff that I use the most often is always going to be methods. And that's true for honestly almost any non-academic research job, because you're almost never going to be doing applied research where you are so specialized on the content front. And so the thing that you're going to be bringing is the methods toolkit, and you will be learning new content all the time. And that's not to say I don't also learn new methods all the time, because I do, and that's something I think is really fun. But it's rare for researchers outside of academia to specialize in subject matter the way that you do in academia.
Right. And with the methods like training that you have, that's kind of like science based, right? Like, because I had another guest kind of like explain to me what methods was, because she co-founded, Elizabeth Bridey, she co-founded the Anthropology Career Readiness Network. And, you know, she loved that they teach like theoretical stuff in school when you're getting your degrees, but she knows that a lot of method work wasn't getting taught as well, because I didn't have any methods class. So she's a big advocate for adding methods into, anthropology departments and whatnot. Because I feel like methods is kind of almost like a science-based research tool.
So, okay, there's a huge debate in anthropology as to whether anthropology is a science and also what science is. I'm so not getting into it. I'm just not going to have an opinion on that one because we'll be here all night and it'll be really boring. But I don't think that having a method necessarily makes you a scientist, in the sense that humanities scholars also have a method. Like close reading is a method. But I do think it's important to be teaching the how and the what. And here are different ways that we can collect data and evidence about the world. And here's what those different ways of collecting data and evidence are good for. I sort of hinted at this before where I said, well, the methods we use, whether we do interviews or surveys or discourse analysis, depends on the questions that we're asking, because different methods are really suited to different kinds of questions. And I think that even that concept is not something that I was taught very well in graduate school. I think I was taught much more, here's how we do field work, go do it, but less, here are the kinds of questions that can be answered with field work. Here are the kinds of questions that can better be answered with surveys. Here are the kinds of things you really have to do interviews for. And I took methods classes, and I still don't feel like that was taught as well as it could have been. So I think I'm in total agreement with Elizabeth that we need to be teaching that. And I bet she said this as well, from a job perspective, it's really useful. That's so much of what newer researchers have to learn is both the skills of how do you conduct a good interview? How do you write a good interview questionnaire? How do you write a good survey? But also what methods map onto what kinds of questions and what's appropriate for what context.
Okay. And for listeners, do you have any recommendations of ways they can get into being an audience researcher?
Sure. One of the hard things about applied research jobs is that the titles are almost never descriptive. So I regularly see jobs with titles like mine. Principal researcher, which, okay, it's a research job. Principal tells you it's a pretty high level of seniority, but doesn't tell you what kind of research. And there are jobs with this title in every field under the sun, so it's really annoying. The keywords really are audience research, and as I mentioned, visitor research, sometimes impact research, sometimes evaluation, program evaluation often is related work. I could just as easily describe what I do as saying I'm an evaluator as anything else. So those would be, I think, the terms that I would be looking for. And there are a lot of us, there are a lot of anthropologists doing all of this kind of work. There's some pretty good classes available in places like Coursera that are free or very inexpensive if you're not at school and looking to learn more. For evaluation in particular, the American Evaluation Association has a really good website with a ton of free resources. And there's also betterevaluation.org. It has a ton of methods, resources. The American Evaluation Association has a job board that's pretty good. So those are places to look.
Okay. So with being an audience researcher, I know that the field varies very widely on what you could be researching, where you're researching, and like if it's private, government, nonprofit, museum work kind of stuff. For those who are looking to get into audience research, what do you think they should be looking for salary-wise?
I'm a firm believer in salary transparency. So let me tell you, I earn just over $100,000 a year right now. I live in one of the most expensive cities in the country, so you'd expect me to earn on the high end. I work in a nonprofit, so you'd expect me to be on the lower end for that reason. And I work in a really small organization, which also tends to mean lower salaries. I'm also pretty senior, if that gives you anything to benchmark.
It's really, really hard to give any sort of average. It's going to depend whether you are in-house at an organization that has an audience research or an impact department versus working for an organization like mine that partners with a lot of different kinds of organizations. It's going to depend on the city you're based in. It's going to depend on what level you're at. It might depend on how much of your role is business development and fundraising. There's so many factors that it's really, really hard to get a pay scale.
Yeah, I was noticing that when I was trying to look up for like a United States average, but it's like, what is an audience researcher? But now, does this position like allow you to travel at all?
I do a lot of US travel for work. I work really closely with some folks based in the Washington, D.C. area and also the folks based in the Boston area. I'm in New York, so those are both a 3 to 4 hour train ride. I go to both cities 2 to 4 times a year, depending on the work I have going on. I do a fair bit of travel to conferences. Travel also really just depends on the project load and the particular partners. Our meetings are overwhelmingly virtual and have been for a long time, even pre-COVID. So most of the travel is for data collection. And again, to DC and Boston, which are relatively close, we'll try to do in-person meetings a couple of times a year because it's not terribly expensive or terribly time-consuming, and we work with enough folks for it to be worth it. Okay. So a lot of the travel I do at this point is conferences and site visits.
Okay, so what are the conferences like? I've never had someone mention that they attend conferences.
Sure. I'm trying to think of the last conference I went to. I've been to journalism conferences. I've been to the American Library Association conferences. I've been to education conferences. And then I've been to a lot of academic conferences. Each one's really different because the audiences are different. The funding is really different. So some of the education conferences have a lot of swag because on the one hand, education is not very well funded. On the other hand, it's a huge sector. And so there's a fair amount of sponsorship, which doesn't happen at, say, academic conferences in the same way, because lots of organizations are trying to get, purchasing agreements with school districts. But it's really hard to generalize because I feel like the kinds of conferences they go to are very different.
Okay. And is that something that your work kind of sends you to, or is it a personal interest as well?
It tends to be for work. So generally, I only go to conferences if I am participating in some way. So either I'm presenting or I'm in some kind of workshop or meeting. It's also not that uncommon to do data collection at conferences. So we work with a fair number of professional societies. And if we're trying to do, say, group conversations with professionals in a single field, conferences can be the best way to organize that.
Cool. Okay. Now, for someone who's interested in getting into audience research, what's your biggest piece of advice to them?
I think my biggest piece of advice is to think about what you want to know before you think about how you're going to find it out. There are a lot of things that are easy to measure that don't tell you very much. My go-to example here is web analytics, where we have a lot of data about website visitors, but a lot of it doesn't tell you anything about what people learned or whether they learned anything. It tells you whether or not they had a web page open. And as I mentioned, one part of the field is thinking about business models and revenue. And so that's important if that's what you're thinking about. But if you're thinking about learning or impacts, you won't get that much from that kind of data. And I don't mean to say that it's not valuable, because it is, but some of the things that are easiest to get are less helpful than we would like. I really want analytics to be more useful than I find them, to be clear. So yeah, it's not that I don't use them, but that I wish they could tell me some of the things that they promise.
Right. And before we get into like the final 3 questions of the interview, was there anything that we haven't talked about today that you kind of want to enlighten the listeners with or discuss?
I feel like I've talked your ear off already.
No, it's been great. I've learned so much because I knew nothing about audience research before this. Even the research I did on audience research, it kind of still didn't make sense to me. And I'm like, okay, well,
does it make more sense now?
A little bit more, yeah. Kind of what you guys do. That it's definitely helped a lot because it's just I never would have. I don't know. It's never something I would have like looked up on my own of like what does an audience research? Because I see UX research a lot, and I'm like, I don't know what that is, but it sounds interesting.
One of the awesome and terrible things about being an adult is that you realize that almost everyone you know has a job you never heard of when you were a kid. You know, you have that book and they're all a farmer and a teacher and a doctor and a firefighter. I mean, I know some people who are teachers and doctors and lawyers, but I know a lot more people who have jobs that just don't appear in those books. And they are project managers, or they are grant writers, or they're, I don't know. But that's both really frustrating and really fun when you're trying to figure out what you want to do.
Yeah, I remember as a kid, like the big career thing was a lot of the kids were like, I'm going to be a marine biologist. I'm like, is that the only science there is? Like, that's the only science I ever hear about is a marine biologist.
Did you grow up on the coast?
Yes, I did.
Okay,
yeah.
So
yeah, Central Florida. So a lot of it was either that or like NASA because it was like right there.
Okay, but that at least makes sense. If you were in, I don't know, Kansas and everyone wanted to be a marine biologist, that would be really fascinating.
Right. It's like, why does everybody want to be a marine biologist in a landlocked state?
Yeah, that would be strange, right? At least in Florida, you can understand that.
Yeah. The appeal.
Yeah, you have some concept of what that is in a way. If you've, say, never been to the ocean, that would be particularly strange.
Yeah, no, definitely. So anyways, what changes do you wish to see either in the field of anthropology, like linguistic anthropology, or in audience research? Either or both?
Oh my gosh. I don't feel like I'm plugged in enough to linguistic anthropology as a field to really be able to answer that question beyond saying, I wish there were more conversations between those of us who feel like the discipline is an intellectual home, but are not in universities, and those of us who are in universities. I think it can be very hard to feel like you belong in some of those very academic conversations when that's not what you do all day.
Right. So what do you absolutely just love about your job?
This is a podcast, so you didn't all see that I just made what I can only describe as an excited nerd face. My eyes got really big and I went, wow, with my mouth. There's a lot of things I really love about the work. First and foremost, I get to keep learning all the time. I'm constantly working on new topics, new projects, new partners, and it's never boring. I kind of get to be an ethnographer formally and informally all the time because I would really describe every time I work with a new partner and trying to understand how they work and what they care about feels like ethnography in the best possible way. So that's something I love. I love conducting interviews and just getting to talk to people and learn from them. I get to do a lot of reading and writing, which I really enjoy. I also get to work on issues that I care about that feel meaningful and important. There's a lot that I really love about the work that I do that I wouldn't trade for the world.
Does it feel like a job to you, or is it like, you know how people say when you love what you do, you never work a day in your life? Is it kind of like that?
Oh, that's bullshit. When you love what you do, you get burnt out because you work too much. I'm just going to be real blunt. It's still work. I don't get to pick every project I do. I don't. Of course, it's still work, right? At the end of the day, I am still doing things so someone pays me. I happen to enjoy 90% of those things, which makes me feel very lucky, but it's totally bullshit and you will burn out otherwise. Sorry, I'm just going to tell it like it is.
No, that's totally okay. So what's the 10% that just kind of makes you go, ugh, job when you're working?
Bureaucracy mostly. And again, it's unavoidable. I don't mean this to be a slight on anyone or anything. this is the lowest percentage of stuff that I don't enjoy at any job I've ever had. I think 10% is really about as good as it gets, to be honest. There's just, you're never going to have a job where you don't occasionally have some tedious crap that you have to do.
Right. Yeah.
In the real world.
Yeah, literally. And so where can listeners learn more about you or the work that you do?
Sure. You should check out my organization's website. We're Knology, KNOLOGY.org. You can also Google me, but honestly, most of the more interesting things I've written recently are either on the Knology site or linked to from the Knology site.
Cool. Yeah, and I'll definitely link all of that in the show notes. So if anybody's interested in checking out Knology or Jena and what they're doing on there, it'll be great. But thank you so much for coming on my podcast. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. I get to nerd out with an excited audience.
Yes.
Yeah, sign me up. That's always fun.
Yes. And if you do any new research or, have any new experiences that you would love to talk about and to nerd out more, I would love to have you on again.
Always.
Yes. All right. Well, you have a great rest of your day, Jena.
Thank you so much. You too.
Thanks. Bye. Thanks for listening to another episode of Anthropuzzled. This show was produced by me. A special thanks to Cheyenne Brewer for editing the website and episode descriptions, and to Leah Akers for the incredible logo design. The music is courtesy of Chad Crouch, aka Poddington Bear of Sound of Picture. If you have any questions, you can reach me at abby.letzinger@anthropuzzled.com. That's abby.letzinger@anthropuzzled.com. Or as Anthropuzzled on Facebook, Instagram, Reddit, or YouTube. Until next time.